3 most important and terrifying theories you need to know before the final episode releases, so grab some tea, stock up on snacks, and let's get started. First, let's talk about Jax's mental state in the final episode. It will consist of 3 stages, and the first one is anger turning into depression. Over the last 3 episodes, Jax has gradually been revealed to us as the most depressed character. Behind the mask of a sarcastic fun guy, there's actually a fragile personality that can't accept the reality of the digital circus. He built himself a made-up world where he felt good, however, once the events started going outside of his usual worldview, everything started falling apart. Constant fear and ongoing panic attacks, the inability to accept help and support from others, all of this creates that big cocktail of internal issues. After the release of episode 8, we were shown a teaser where Jax is staring at the floor with a blank stare, separated from everyone else. Even back then, you could assume that Jax would completely cut off all ties with the other characters. After watching the trailer, we were convinced that the first minutes after what happened will be pretty strange for Jax. He doesn't understand what's going on, and after that, he starts actively showing his aggression. The problem is that none of this is going to help either Jax or the others, and the rabbit himself understands that perfectly well. Because of his weak character, he has no choice but to fully sink into his own issues. In the first half of episode 9, Jax's depression will gradually get worse and turn into the second stage, madness. Several scenes from the trailer show us Jax from a very unusual side. His stare and behavior actually create a really unsettling feeling. An empty and insane stare, a forced smile, strange movements, all of this is the result of a severe depressive state combined with negative external factors. Jax's inability to accept help might become the key issue for this character, which will lead to the third stage, destabilization. The trailer shows that in this state, the characters will stay for a long time, which means all the previous stages of Jax's mental breakdown can actually lead to destabilization. In that case, Jax's personality will gradually start to fall apart, so to speak. None of his actions will have any rational explanation, and he'll completely lose control over himself and his mind. We've already seen all of this in Kaufmo's case, who also went from a fake cheerful guy to a completely broken personality. His room is a perfect reflection of the destabilization stage he went through, and this image directly references the scene with Jax. We see a very similar environment around the characters, but while Kaufmo is facing his abstracted version, Jax is turned away. It's obvious that this is just a vision and not some actual location with an abstracted monster inside. We already talked about how abstraction is a programmed process that doesn't depend on Kane. Even though Kane can quickly find a glitch in the code while it's still fixable, he can't fully fix a character once they've reached the terminal stage, which means this process can easily still happen even with Kane deleted. Also, I was really intrigued by this scene from the trailer where Pomni walks into Jax's room and then says his name in a scared and uncertain voice.
Jax?
Obviously, she saw something horrible, however, it's unlikely that it will be abstraction. At this point, I'm sure that none of the current cast will turn into that creature in the digital circus finale. However, if in Kaufmo's case he actually became a monster, Jax might have a completely different outcome. Because of a breakdown in his code, Jax might enter a state of what you could call a permanent hallucination, where his life feels just as joyful as it used to. In that case, this scene with Ribbit might not be a pleasant memory, but rather something that's happening inside Jax's head right now. There's this concept called 3-ring circus, and if we keep it short, events happen in 3 rings at the same time to make things more spectacular and grand scale. This is reflected in the digital circus ecosystem itself, since we also have 3 main locations where the most important events take place: the digital circus tent, the created worlds, and the cellar where all the abstracted monsters are kept. But even that's not the main thing, because the concept of 3 is directly shown at the core of the digital circus, not only through constant hints at this number, but also through the use of 3 colors. Literally, in the very first scene of the pilot, they put a clear emphasis on blue, red, and yellow. What's funny is that all 3 of these colors are also present in Pomni's outfit, as well as in her room. The concept of 3 and the emphasis on the color yellow can be seen throughout all the digital circus episodes, and that's clearly not a coincidence. Having understood the foundation of the digital circus, we can move on to the next chapter and hear some environmental details, and kind of the digital circus code will help us. Some people have already pointed out that when trying to restore a backup, the system offered a choice of 3, A, B, and C. At the very beginning of episode 8, we were shown a brief history of Kane's development and the creation of the digital circus. It's not hard to guess that the red AI is Kane, while the blue AI is Abel, who was then successfully absorbed by Kane. However, the question of what the backup under the letter B actually is still remains open. In that same scene, we see an example of feeding information by uploading yellow-colored data, and at this point, we can already assume that the third AI was yellow. Also, if you look at the blocks in Pomni's room, you can notice that all the other letters stay different colors, while the block with the letter B is always yellow. I also found a pretty interesting detail that I haven't heard anyone talk about yet. Maybe I missed something, but as of now, among all the possible blocks, the ones with the letter B appear only in Pomni's room. Summing up the first part, we understand that the system the C&A employees were developing is built around a trio: 3 colors, 3-ring circus, and of course 3 AIs. At first glance, it all seems obvious. B is Bubble, but let's dig a little deeper. There were actually a lot of theories about who Bubble is, and some people even seriously suggested that Bubble is Abel, because if you say a bubble, it can kind of sound like Abel. However, let's remember a post Gooseworks made back in summer 2023, explaining who Bubble is. Goose said that Bubble is another AI created by Kane, a weird little creature that lives in his hat. Basically, Bubble is just a kind of assistant to Kane, however with a small twist. From the very beginning, we saw how Bubble behaved pretty strangely, and that raised a lot of questions, but now we understand the true nature of this character. Bubble is the dark side of Kane, his real fears and anxieties. Saying everything we heard at the start of episode 8, it wasn't Bubble trying to push Kane out of control, it was just Kane basically voicing what he actually thinks about himself. Right now, Bubble is gone along with Kane, and that makes sense because they're basically one single organism, so let's just move on from Bubble. Now, with Kane, things get way more interesting, but I'll keep it as short as possible here. In episode 8, we saw how Kane absorbed Abel. The only thing that might hint at that is his blue eye. His red AI side is reflected in his outfit, but the inside of his suit and his cane are yellow. What if that's another clear hint at the existence of a third AI? The only thing that doesn't quite fit into this picture is his green eye Jeffrey, which is basically a foreign object capable of moving on its own. At this point, I don't fully understand what role Jeffrey actually plays. However, I've got a theory that he might be some kind of reference to something not connected to Kane but tied to the third AI, but more on that a bit later. We've gradually come to the conclusion that the yellow AI really did exist, however its fate is completely unknown to us. We figured out that neither Bubble nor the bees have anything to do with the yellow AI, and basically it all looks like we have a lot of important information, but at the same time nothing concrete, and all we've got left right now is trying to piece everything together. In this video, I've mentioned Pomni and her room a few times, and now let's talk about how Pomni could be connected to the third AI. Probably the most obvious thing is to once again bring up Pomni's outfit, which is completely made up of the main digital circus colors. If we judge by area, then yeah, blue and red definitely dominate. However, it's important to point out that all the accent details are done specifically in yellow. On top of that, like I mentioned earlier, the yellow block with the letter B appears only in Pomni's room. I'm pretty sure none of this is random, and to understand my next thoughts a bit deeper, let's take a look at a couple scenes featuring this character.
Find Kane! He'll be able to fix me up and take care of Kaufmo!
Okay. God, where's Kane?
At this point, among the so-called regular humans who ended up in the digital circus, only Pomni is able to use the ability to create objects and even entire locations inside the system. Kinger can do it too, but his situation is completely different. He's one of the main creators of the digital circus, and he fully understands all these details, while Pomni ended up in the digital circus by accident, and basically had these abilities right away on a subconscious level. If you forgot or didn't catch it, in the moment when Regatha says they need to call Kane to fix her, Pomni's glitching hand for a short moment became completely normal. Or that door from the pilot episode. Pomni was obsessed with it, and without even realizing it, she managed to recreate what she was looking for on her own. Only in episode 8, she finally realized she can control it successfully, and that's why we got 2 identical scenes, but with completely different meanings. Basically, at this point, we already understand that there's something in Pomni's code that completely sets her apart from the other characters. Since the blue and red AI is Kane, the only thing that could be helping Pomni is the third yellow AI. Also, let's talk a bit about Kaufmo, who has a lot in common with Pomni. They're both the same type of character, both obsessed with escape, and both of their outfits are made up exclusively of these 3 colors. I don't think that's just a coincidence. There's most likely a pattern here, and before ending up in Pomni's code, the yellow AI might have been part of Kaufmo. However, I still can't get the letter B out of my head. The names Pomni and Kaufmo don't even come close to hinting at B, and I started thinking how this could be connected. I only have one kind of logical, but at the same time pretty crazy explanation for this, and it all comes down to the circus. If someone says circus to you, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Of course, a clown. I get that a clown and a jester aren't exactly the same thing, but their core idea is really similar. A clown is basically the face of the circus, the thing everyone associates with it, and it makes sense that the clown is kind of the main figure in a circus. I'm really glad we were shown the original digital circus cast and their names were revealed because everyone remembers what the first character of this type was called, Bizco. What if B is just short for the name of the first jester? And even though, like I said, it sounds kind of crazy, there is some logic to it. It's very possible that during development, alongside the red and blue AI, the C&A employees were also working on a yellow AI that served completely different purposes than the first two. It was developed as some kind of add-on and a safety measure in case everything started falling apart. The third AI wasn't meant to be a full entity capable of controlling elements inside the system. It was more like something embedded within the code of a specific character. The yellow AI knows how the system, the digital circus, exists and actually works, and it's the one that helped Pomni in the pilot episode. Basically, its job is to save the main character, and after realizing that Kaufmo was starting to lose his mind, the third AI kept trying more and more to explain to the clown how everything works, trying to bring his mental state back to normal. However, it looks like because of heavy code corruption, the third AI was already powerless in Kaufmo's case, but with Pomni, it still might end successfully. At the end, let me remind you about Jeffrey. What if this so-called character represents those who are able to act independently from the system, to break out of the usual limits like Pomni does with the help of the third AI? Of course, we can't rule out what Kinger said that anyone can do something like this, but it's important to see the difference between conscious and subconscious actions. Any wrong move can lead to a character ending up inside the void, and that's actually dangerous. In the pilot episode, we saw that once Pomni got there, her consciousness basically shut off, and only thanks to Kane she was able to come back. The void is actually a pretty interesting kind of system zone of the digital circus. To be more precise, the digital circus and absolutely all the territory around it, any world created by Kane, all of that is part of the void. In episode 8, Kinger told us that the digital circus wasn't something created by C&A. They were developing a creative AI, which we know as Kane, and were gradually feeding him certain knowledge, including things related to a circus. That's why once inside the system, Kane created the digital circus and everything around it himself, and that's exactly why it was partially destroyed right after Kane disappeared. It's important to understand that Kane didn't create this entire system, he was placed inside it. All of this leads us to the idea that absolutely no one can control what happens to the characters inside the void, and the only thing you can do is bring them back to a so-called safe zone where their consciousness can actually function. Going back to one of the scenes from episode 7, we remember this.
Kane is an AI, specifically created to keep your minds active.
We see clear confirmation of this in that same scene from the pilot, and this is where things get really interesting. If one of Kane's roles was to preserve the lives and functionality of the characters, then after his disappearance, no one will be able to save them if they end up in the void. In that same pilot episode, we were shown how after wandering through the void for a long time, we end up in the exact room Pomni entered the digital circus from. This once again proves that the void isn't just some unused part of the digital circus that Kane hasn't explored yet, but a full system that no one can control. That's also what Kane's panic was about when he found out someone ended up inside the void. The system itself is at least 3 kilometers long, and we learned that by looking at the Wacky Watch, and now just imagine the characters finding out the truth about this place, and that if they make it all the way through, they can escape. Sounds pretty good until you realize the void isn't a straight line, but a 3-dimensional space, and even though Pomni was moving in a straight path here, no one knows how the system might react to a new object suddenly appearing. What if the system itself changes the trajectory of a character, and considering what we talked about earlier, we could end up with a character endlessly drifting through the void without even realizing it? This would have been an easy problem for Kane to solve, but his disappearance turned to entering the void from a minor inconvenience into a fatal mistake that can't be fixed anymore.
They began forcibly hooking my fellow co-workers up to the computer in special stasis pods that would keep them alive and analyze their brains. Just awful stuff.
On one hand, everything here seems obvious. The characters' real bodies are in stasis pods, and if they somehow manage to leave the digital circus, they'll just return to their bodies and everything will be fine. However, there are a few details here that we just can't ignore. In episode 5, Pomni and Zubul made it clear that they ended up in the digital circus after finding a headset inside abandoned buildings. No one else talked about this, and it's logical to assume the others ended up in the digital circus directly through C&A. Considering that Pomni and Zubul were the last ones to end up inside the digital circus, we can assume that C&A no longer exists. At least not on the same scale as during the Scratch era. Maybe some of the scientists are still observing things, but just imagine how much money it would take to maintain all the stasis pods where the characters' bodies used to be kept. In that same episode 7, Jax revealed that all of them ended up in the digital circus because of a headset, and I feel like after the first successful consciousness transfers, CNA managed to upgrade the tech and fit everything into a compact device. They no longer needed massive machines to transfer consciousness, but they still had to store the still-living bodies somewhere. Ragatha's initial reaction to the digital circus hints that everything was supposed to be fine at first, which again might suggest that she was in a CNA office where she was tricked into putting on the headset, and after that you already know what happened. Compare her first reaction to Pomni's. Ragatha is trying to figure out where she is and calling out to someone, while Pomni has no idea what's going on at all. All of this was leading to the idea that originally the characters' real bodies were supposed to be inside stasis pods in a state of suspended animation. However, considering that even if someone from CNA is still continuing their work, they no longer have the resources to maintain devices like that, which means there's a high chance that the people who became these characters in the digital world are already dead in the real world. So this leads us to understand that right now the characters are truly trapped. There's no one left who can control the processes around them. Any wrong move or decision can lead to an early end. Returning to the real world is theoretically possible, but in practice it's almost impossible. Even if someone does manage to get out, there's nowhere to return to in the real world because the real person who later became a character is most likely already dead.